Alright, this supplemental material lecture is going to be going over just sort of the basics of WPF. Now remember, in the future Microsoft is only going forward with WPF. Windows Forms is obsolete, no one's using it anymore, no one's maintaining it anymore, there's no more bug fixes for it. However, there's a tremendous amount of legacy applications written in Windows Forms, so you still need to be aware of it and how to maintain it. However, you probably need to be more efficient in WPF than Windows Forms. So sometimes students get a little bit scared to move forward in WPF. It seems harder at first, like there's a little bit more to it, and there is a little bit more of a learning curve. However, again, it's just the way things are done now with Microsoft, so you need to feel comfortable using it. Again, it's analogous to HTML in our XAML here, versus, and then having like some other programming language at the back end. There's WPF and then C# in our back end. So I'm going to show you, just kind of talk about a few of the basics again with WPF. So one of the things, if you really feel uncomfortable at first or you're scared using it, one of the things I would recommend doing is when you first open a window, change this to Canvas. And the reason you want to do that is this is actually going to make it act extremely similar to Windows Forms. Now, if in the end product, that whatever you're creating, you didn't care about the resolution, you could hard code things in. You don't need the things to be dynamic, grow and shrink for different resolutions or whatever your issue is. Then a canvas works quite easy. And what's nice about a canvas is, I drag a button over here, and you'll notice that it actually is hard coded the location of where this button is. And as I moved it around, it just changed this. So this behavior is exactly like Windows Forms. Same that if I dragged, say, a label now next to my button. They're hard coded, but there's never going to be any dynamic nature to it where when the form grows or shrinks that these buttons and labels are going to move around or grow, based on the pixels. So if that's not the behavior you want, sometimes a canvas works just great and it's easier to work with than say a grid or stack panels, things of that nature. So what is a stack panel? Well, a stack panel is going to, I can drag and drop in here just to kind of give me an idea of what the stack panel is. And so the stack panel itself, all it does is stacks items on top of each other. So if I had buttons inside of this stack panel, and let's say I add the content, so you can see as I add more buttons into my stack panel, they are positioned relative to each other and they're just stacked on top of each other. Now the stack panel itself has an orientation where I can now change it to say horizontal, and you can see that they do this. Now you'll notice that the stack panel itself is hard-coded its position to the canvas it's within, but the controls within the stack panel are relative to each other. They're stacked on top of each other, and they can kind of give you this flexibility of growing and shrinking. So the other thing that's a little bit different in WPF is, let's drag, say, like a checkbox on here. If we come over to our properties, I like to do it by name, but WPF, you'll notice that a lot of the properties start with is. So is enabled, is visible, those sort of things. And so when I click on the checkbox, for instance, and we take a look now, you can see that there's the is checked property. And always remember, anything you do over here in the properties windows, this is the reason it's called properties is because you're accessing properties of a class. So just like any other thing in Windows Forms, in WPF I can double click this button to get the check changed event. If it was a button, I could double click it and it's going to give me the click event. And the same that I can click on this over here, click on my lightning bolt, and you can see sure enough it's handling the checked event by default. If I go to a button, it just happened to assign a click by default. It just said, hey, this is what's going to make most sense. So on my checkbox, when it's checked or unchecked, this is the code that's going to run. And so you can see, hopefully that's extremely similar to Windows Forms. The difference is in Windows Forms, it created that designer.cs file where it sort of hooked up how the events worked, where in XAML now, in WPF, you can see the events are right here within the XAML itself. And then so what actually is going to happen is when you run this application or compile it, the CLR and the compiler actually takes this XAML code and will compile it down into C# code itself, and that's actually what gets ran. So now let me go ahead and delete out all of this. And one of the more confusing concepts is just how to create, say, a grid and actually position out an application and how to create it. And so I just kind of want to walk through a simple application on how I would go about solving it. So let's pretend that we want to create some sort of very, very simple calculator control that has, some sort of like a text box up here or a text block up here, then some numbers and ways you can multiply it. So what I did was I then thought to myself, okay, let's sketch it out. So here's my awesome drawing, and so we're going to pretend that this is some sort of text block up here, or text or label. And then we've got these other labels that the user can click to enter numbers, and then obviously, the add, multiply, and divide along the right. So I look at this and I can say, okay, this is how I want to lay this out. And I don't want to hard code things, I want to do it correctly, so I'm going to use, let's say, a grid. And so I can notice that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. So let's go ahead and set up a grid that will dynamically grow and shrink based on the window size, that again has 5 columns and 4 rows. Just to get a very, very basic calendar sort of setup. So we've got our grid. It's going to take up the whole form, but now we're actually going to create a grid that actually holds our actual calculator itself. And so the first thing we want to do now is set up our rows. So we can say grid dot row definitions, since we're setting up the definitions for all of our rows. So now let's actually define each individual row. So I can say row definition, and we want to set the height, and what I'm going to use is the star syntax. And so what this is going to say is I want this row to take up as much possible room as it can. And so now we need 5 rows, 2, 3, 4. So we can see that we need, again, 5 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's our 5 rows. And you can kind of see now how it's being broken out up here above. Let me zoom out just a teeny bit there. That didn't work too well, but you get the idea. So there's our grid that's being created. So now we need to create our columns. So now what we can do is I can say grid, you can see column definitions. And so rather than a row definition, we'll now create a column definition. And instead of height, we're going to be setting width. And same thing, let's just say, hey, we want it to take up as much room as we wanted. We could put the number 50 in here, and that would give us a column of, say, 50 pixels. And maybe on an application that makes sense, where the first column you want it to be hard-coded and always be fixed in size. Maybe the rest of the columns you want to make them dynamic. In our application, we're going to want all of our columns and rows to be dynamic. And so I'm going to go ahead and create 4 columns now. So now it's time to actually add in all of our labels. So the first one that we need to add in is where we're going to do all of our display. So we're going to have this label here. Now I'm going to hard code in exactly which columns and rows. So I'm going to say I want this in the first column of the first row. And so that's going to put this label right here in the first column and first row. It's 0 based. Now what I actually want is my label to go over, to span this entire top row up here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say grid dot column span 4. And so what that's going to do now is that's going to take up, oops, mistyped that. So it's going to take up the entire column at the top. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to set the background. Let's set this equal to yellow. And so we can see, sure enough, it takes up the entire background. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set up our labels for our numbers and then our add, multiply, and divide. So let's go ahead and let's just focus on this next row down now. So now we've got our top row here, so now we need 7, 8, 9, and multiply. So we come in here and we're going to create another label. And we want this to be grid.column. So now we want the first column again, so this is also going to be 0. And now we want grid.row, and this one we're going to want the first row. So this is 0, and then we want the 1 row, which is actually the second row. Here we're going to do our content. And you'll notice our content is 7. So we're going to set that equal to 7. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make our font size a lot larger so we can easily read it on the screen. What I'm also going to do is set the horizontal content alignment to center. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make our font size a lot larger so we can easily read it on the screen. What I'm also going to do is set the horizontal content alignment to center. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make our font size a lot larger so we can easily read it on the screen. What I'm also going to do is set the horizontal content alignment to center. And then I'm going to set the background color to something like red so we can easily see it. Do this and our XAML should show back up. And so you'll notice what I've done now is that I've created a label here that users will be able to click for our number 7 button. So let's go ahead and create the number 8 button. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire row again. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit more room. So now, instead of the first column, I want to be on the same row, but I want to be on the next column over. I want to change this to 8, and maybe change this to blue so we can just see a difference in the color there. Go ahead and do the next one, the next column over, which is 2. We want this to be 9. Can make this gray. Now let's do one more. Make this column 3. And this is going to be our multiply in our particular example. So we'll just make this X. And so now I'm going to go ahead and run this application so we can take a look at it. And so hopefully you can see the beginnings of our calculator where our numbers are going to be appear up here after the user clicks them here. Now you'll notice is as I expand and contract this application, because we have the star syntax, you can see how they're actually growing and shrinking. So just real quickly, I'm going to do one more row. I think you'll kind of get the idea there where now instead of row 1, we'll just do row 2. 5, 6, 7. You know, we can do divide, doesn't really matter. And so again, I could just add in the rest of the rows, but you should be able to see now how much more dynamic and flexible this particular calendar control is versus if we just hard coded it with a canvas and dragged and dropped these labels on there, we wouldn't get this dynamic ability. So this is kind of a very basic intro again of grids and labeling, and it's just going to take time. You just kind of work through the problem, and you could have grid within grids, but if you just kind of sketch it out beforehand and just kind of plan on it, it's really not too hard to work through the problems. So if you have any issues with your WPF formatting, just shoot me an email, and I'm always here to help.